I mean, the last 10 or 15 years, something that I've noticed is that there is an increased tendency for people to wander around with bottles of water. So if you go into a lecture theatre, you will see perhaps several dozen bottles of water. You go into an examination, there are bottles of water. Never true in my day, although that was more than 10 years ago. And again, people have even pieces of equipment that are designed to allow you to suck a drink in case you become dehydrated walking between your car and your place of work. And there seemed to be some sort of assumption that dehydration, of a presumably mild nature, is really rather commonplace, that many of us, much of the time, are dehydrated. And I just went on search engine, and there are hundreds of such, just to get a sort of feel of what people are sort of saying. It affects brain function and mood. Mental ability affected immensely. Lethargy, mental fatigue, memory problems, and confusion. Can it really be the case that evolution has done such a poor job that people living in temperate countries, if they don't drink every hour or so, that their brain doesn't function terribly well? Seems inherently improbable. We looked at the literature such as it is, and some of you may have noticed that the title on the sheet and the title on the slides are different, and that's to a large extent because there isn't a literature on much of certainly the longer term effects. But we found 19 studies that considered mood, and without exception they reported at least one dimension. Usually people found that they felt they were less alert, felt more tired. But they are almost, again, the vast majority of these were studies where people had exercised in hot conditions. So it's very hard to be confident that whatever effects are actually due to dehydration and not to just general fatigue from exercising or perhaps an increase in body temperature. Comparison, if one looked at measures of cognition of one sort or another, 13 out of 25. And many of these had many measures, and at least one was significant. So there's the general feel that the first signs are going to be these subjective measures of mood. But importantly, these are studies where there's been at least 2% loss of body weight. Some general comments. The samples were generally rather small. Too small to pick up anything other than very large effects. It seems to me fairly obvious, coming from my background, that if you wanted to demonstrate a role for hydration, you would dehydrate people, then try and rehydrate them and see if you could get decreases and improvements in performance. This has been done surprisingly infrequently. And as already has been commented, these were young, usually athletic adults, more often males than females. So if we want to say things about people who are younger or older, really there's little evidence. Again, I'm sure everyone knows this, changes in the hormonal patterns, follicular stage, estrogen rise, and the luteal stage, progesterone, thought to relate to ability to maintain hydration. Here we've, just as a convenient summary from the American College of Sports Medicine, various things, greater antidiuretic hormone responses during estrogen administration with oral contraceptives. Oral contraceptives improve sweating during exercise. So the point is just quite simply that we need A, to look at women, B, we need to look at women at different stages of the menstrual cycle, and this just simply hasn't been done. And also, I think, in the context of these studies, I mean, many of them have been, I think, come out of people who are interested in exercise and looking for really quite large effects when quite unreasonable to expect, if you're looking at changes in cognition, that you're going to get them. And just to sort of make this point, the title given by Ron was looking at quality of life. And increasingly, when people run medical type experiments, they measure whatever they normally measure, but often you're asked to put in a measure of quality of life. And what we have here is a review which has looked at the effect of such studies. And there is quite a consistent finding that to get a significant effect in reported improvement in quality of life, you need an effect that is about half a standard deviation. If you just put that into power statistics, 80% power, 0.5 level of significance, something fairly typical, you need 2 samples of 63. Most people around the table would think this is just totally unacceptable and unreasonable, but that is what the numbers suggest. If you look at a typical study in this area, 10, I don't think 10 is typical. It's actually certainly not, by no means, the smallest. Compare 10 people with another 10 people, you would be able, according to the power statistics, to distinguish 1.25 standard deviations. Well, a definition of a large effect size is 0.8. So what one's saying is that really these are studies that are just grossly underpowered, and as such are telling us very little about the phenomenon that we wish to consider. So we're talking about 2% changes in most of these studies. Here we have a sort of a very respectable source of information. Fluid losses of about 1% can lead to successively to reduction in exercise performance. Study looking at good Muslims who are restraining from consuming food or drink during the hours of daylight. In the United Kingdom, that'll be 18 to 19 hours. I did wonder what happened if you live in the north of Norway, and the answer is you use Mecca as the default, or obviously you'd die if you didn't. Getting up to about 1% of body mass. So we're very different from most of these studies. And here we've got some others. Variability about 1%, 3%, 1%, sorry, 0.1%, but importantly, substantial individual differences. And I think this is really will be key in this area. I think average scores will probably not differ, but I think there are quite marked individual differences within these. Some work we're ongoing. We're keeping people at 30 degrees for 4 hours. We're sort of by repeatedly weighing them, we're distinguishing the loss due to perspiration in urine. And just look at the bottom here. The average loss is 0.65% of body weight. So we're not talking anywhere near 2%. And of course, it's the nature of the phenomenon that most people will not stay at 30 degrees for 4 hours without drinking. So, you know, if we are talking about effects, we're talking about effects that are really going to be quite small. But what I think is important is that the individuals differed quite markedly, fourfold, in the extent to which, under these constant conditions, when they weren't drinking, and the extent to which they lost weight. So individual differences, I think, are going to be very important. And just showing that it's related to something. This was the loss of body weight, and whether you felt more or less thirsty. And as you can see, if you lost relatively small amounts of body weight, you felt less thirsty than those that consumed more. So if we are interested in what normal people do, going about their normal lives, consuming liquid in the way that they probably normally do. We're probably talking at the very most about changes of 0.5 of body mass. Considerable individual differences. It's also an area where small sample sizes are going to decrease the chances of significant findings because they will mask, they will add greatly to the variation in what is inherently a small difference. And so I think to date, quite simply, the topic has not been addressed in any systematic way whatsoever. So is this just simply wrong? Is this sort of idea that we should be, that people can become underhydrated just simply wrong? Can we find evidence with less than 2% of body weight loss? I know Phil is going to have some comments about this, but this is he sort of is not terribly positive about this whole area. But it's interesting, and I think it tells us something about perhaps the way forward. That dehydration clearly will decrease the volume of blood. It will potentially change the osmotic nature such that tissue shrinks, and necessarily, the brain inside your skull is going to consist of your brain, the blood, and the cerebrospinal fluid. And the suggestion is that if you are dehydrated at some point, this has got to be true. Whether it's true within the normal working day is another question. That your brain will shrink because of osmotic changes, perhaps less blood, and compensate so your brain doesn't rattle around inside your skull. The spinal fluid levels increase. So we've got inside the brain the ventricles, these chambers that contain fluid. It's being renewed. The cerebrospinal fluid is being renewed about 18 times a day. This is not a study of dehydration, but just to illustrate what's going on. I mean, there are two types of brain imaging. One is structural changes. One just looks at the size of particular things, and others functional changes. And this is a sort of structural study. You've got a whole series of slices, and you're measuring the volume of the ventricles. A study published in 2012, people were given 3 to 4 liters of water to drink over 12 hours, and on other occasions they consumed only 150 mils a day. And this is the change in the ventricle size relative to the baseline. As you can see, when you drank a lot of water, the brain swelled to some extent, and when you drank a little water, it shrank. And if you looked at differences in the one to the other, you can sort of see differences in the ventricles. I mean, arguably, of course, both of those conditions are grossly abnormal, but it does at least demonstrate the principle, although it doesn't demonstrate that it occurs on a regular basis. Here we have another study, another group, and changes body mass and changes in ventricular size. There is a sort of, these were individual scores in a regression line. As you can see, you're getting up to 7.5% change in volume at about 2.1% change in body mass. When one gets down to about 1, you get nothing. Whether I think that I don't think you can conclude from that there is an effect. There is possibly an effect. And here we have, I think, probably the only study to date of that has looked at functional MRI. Here you're giving a task. What is the blood flow, the activity of the particular area of the brain? It's a sort of task called Tower of London, Tower of Hanoi. You start off with balls on sticks, in particular order, and the answer is you've got to end up with this pattern. How many moves do you need? It's a measure of planning, frontal lobe functioning. So it's a sort of executive functioning. It's not that the task is necessarily that difficult, but you've got to plan, you've got to think. And the question is, what happens when you are dehydrated. And the report is that not that the task was performed less poorly, and probably the sample, well, not poorly, definitely the sample size was too small to get a significant finding in terms of the actual behavior. But what they found was that the amount of effort needed by the brain was acting less efficiently when it was in a dehydrated state. And it seems to me that this is at least, that one doesn't want to draw any conclusion from one study, but this is the sort of degree of sensitivity that I think we need if we are going to seriously consider this sort of task, this area. So we've got, in summary, there is a suggestion that Phil may question that the dehydration causes the brain to shrink. To date, it's about a loss of 1% of body weight. What I would say is that this is a colossally crude measure of brain functioning, and that it seems to me almost inevitable that if you are literally changing the volume of the brain, that you are going to pick up effects of a functional nature with less than 1%. And that it seems to me that functional imaging offers a means of approaching this, and certainly that's a study that we are just about to begin. The other question is, are there some groups that are more susceptible? I mean, an older group is one that one repeatedly talks about in terms of decreased functioning of the kidneys, a decreased response to thirst, or whatever. I find no literature whatsoever on that. But what there are a small number of studies with children who are thought to be at high risk for various reasons. They depend on others for their source of liquid. They're more active, they've got a greater surface area to their mass. So they're seen as being a high-risk group. Study we carried out a few years ago, we went into a school. This wasn't dehydrating children, it was rehydrating them. The school allowed children to have drinks, and some children had water bottles. Temperature was about 20 degrees, so it wasn't exactly overly warm. And they had their normal eating patterns. At lunch, they had a drink available of 200 mils. And we gave them particular tests on 2 occasions. Once when, in the mid-afternoon, they'd had a drink of water, and another occasion when they hadn't. And any one day, half the class had the water and half the class didn't. We simple test of memory, have a look at that, how many items do you recall? And what we found was that the delayed memory, they did initially then perform some other tasks, and then they were asked, remember those items, how many do you remember? There was a significantly less poorer memory when there was on the occasions they had not been given a drink. Another occasion, children in school, one day, again, half had a drink, half didn't. Observed for 30 minutes when they were working as individuals. Temperature of the classroom was 24 degrees. These weren't children who 58% had drunk both at breakfast and lunch, and 13% 3 or more times. So, you know, they weren't children who weren't drinking. We used what's called activity sampling. It's at any particular point, you know, sort of perhaps every 10 seconds. What are you doing exactly now? It's carried out double blind, and you end up with hundreds of measures, and you can produce a percentage of the time that you spend doing something. So this wasn't our classroom, it's just a picture I found. But these little girls are working hard. That little boy is finding the ceiling compulsively interesting. I do hope my employer doesn't work out this, how much time you spend at the coffee machine. Anyway, the effects really were quite startling. Well, these were the same kids, sometimes with water, sometimes without. As you can see, these are actually very high percentages of time on task. We've been in other schools that for less advantaged areas where the standards, the time spent on task much less. But you can see that the days they didn't have water, they spent much less time doing what they were meant to be doing. There are also, and Caroline's here, and a couple of her studies, some children improved visual attention memory. Another study, children said they were happier, visual attention, visual search was better, but not in this case, memory. So what we've got are 4 studies that have found a benefit from drinking water. So there seems to be some evidence that children are a group that certainly should be studied some more. Again, probably 4 studies are too few to come to any great conclusion if you're sensible. The conclusion, and I'm just about on time, is that there are certainly lots of reports that particularly mood and some aspects of cognition are affected when you get to about 2% of body weight, but this doesn't distinguish the effect of fatigue from body temperature and changes. That if we are really interested in what people do in their everyday life, we really should be looking certainly at less than 0.5, probably 0.5 is getting up towards the higher range. But what I think my personal take is that what is important is that there are marked individual differences in the tendency to become dehydrated, and that is what we're working on at the moment. And we're finding some relationships between, on average, you don't get a significant effect, but you do get a relation. Some people who have this tendency to become dehydrated, we do get changes in mood and cognition, although this is work that's ongoing. And at the moment, the children are a group where there's the most evidence of a response to liquid. One, I suppose, could add the comment that the older adults are a group that should be studied but haven't been. Thank you very much indeed.
And thank you for keeping time. And now the paper is open for discussion. And as it is said, the 2 discussants are Dr. Caroline Edmonds and Dr. Phil Watson. Who will we start first? Ladies first? No, Phil. Okay.
I think you raise an interesting point in the sense that there's been a variety of studies. Most of them have used a very acute intervention to introduce this dehydrated state. So generally relatively hard exercise in a warm environment or a period of fluid and food restriction, which then induces dehydration over a relatively short period of time. Typically, they're young, typically male students, fit, healthy. And something that we've observed and a couple of other groups have observed is that there is a decrement in some aspects of cognitive function immediately following exercise, and that's what you alluded to with the body temperature and fatigue. But if you give them a period of time to recover, so you allow them to have a shower, sit in a room, recover, they receive no fluid whatsoever, so they remain hypohydrated. Many of these decrements in cognitive function return to baseline, so there's nothing there. So yeah, is the message overplayed? Is I guess, and this is fit, healthy, young males, and something we've coined a term of the PlayStation generation, and that in these particular individuals, they've got a lot of cognitive reserve. The tests we give them are very simple compared to the hours and hours that many of these students spend playing whatever video game, World of Warcraft or whatever. So you really have to stress them to get any decrement.
Well, if I just comment on that, I spend my life talking to nutritionists saying, tell me which test to use. We want a gold standard. What is the battery we should be using? And they've looked at psychology, and what we're not short of are thousands of tests, and they just think the whole thing is a mess. But the simple fact is that what's going on is that it's absolutely essential to relate the task to the ability of the group. So so whether people, their education level, their basic intelligence, how old they are, are all variables, and a lot of the skill is, it's very easy to get either ceiling effects, i.e. everyone gets near to 100%, or floor effects, no one can do anything. And you've got to suddenly just pitch it right for that group. And that's as much an art as a science. And it's often a matter of suck it and see. So, you're absolutely right. I mean, sometimes the solution is that you give dual tasks. Because you try to get them to the limits of their cognitive ability by asking them to do two things at once. So you hit a very relevant point, and it's extremely easy to get negative data. And if you don't actually have a feel for what you're doing, and particularly if you just look in a paper and use a test without actually any experience of it or sort of thinking too much about it. So I think that's a very valid point.
Can I weigh in on that?
Please.
We did a study that we published in 2007, excuse me, and it related almost exactly to the design you talked about. They're young, healthy, fit males. These happened to be basketball players, fairly elite basketball players. We did exactly what you described, and that is we dehydrated them by having them exercise in a hot environment on 4 separate occasions, 5 with the control, to 1%, 2%, 3%, or 4%. And then we gave them hours to recover. They recovered from fatigue, they recovered heart rate, core temperature, everything but the fluid deficit. And then we tested them using an attention-related vigilance task. So they had to sit there for 2 hours and stare at a monitor. And the one thing that generation is good at is PlayStation and cognitive function. The one thing they're not good at is paying attention to minor details over a long period of time. And so we did see deficits related to the dehydration, separate from any influences of fatigue or body temperature. And surprising to us, those deficits were significant starting at the 2% dehydration level. At 1%, there were some small...
What was the sample size?
Sample size was probably 12 to 15, I can't recall.
So again, you were using sample size where you were looking for something really substantial. And if you wanted to, I would say that, I mean, that's an excellent design. And I've been asking you for the reference because it should be added to the paper. But I mean, the point is that if you are looking for an effect less than about 2%, you really are going to need large sample sizes. There's just no avoiding it.
This test, by the way, gives an ADHD score. So it's used to diagnose ADHD in children. And so if you had tested these perfectly intelligent and highly functional, fit 20-year-olds with 2% dehydration, you would have scored them as having attention deficit disorder.
I suspect that's true for some of my colleagues, but there we are.
I just wanted to ask a related thing on that, which is that if you reliably get effects on mood at 1% dehydration and you have to go higher to get effects on cognitive performance, is that potentially related to the fact that people are trying very hard at the early stages? So they're performing, trying harder on the test of cognitive performance, which ties in with the Kempton study where they found increased blood flow to the frontal lobe, suggesting that there was more cognitive effort in those early stages.
Well, I mean, anyone who's worked with human beings knows that they're much more of a pain than rats. I mean, you're right. I mean, if you're not functioning well, but you're motivated, you've got reserves. Yeah. I mean, that will also. A very common idea in terms of the aging process is that there is a cognitive reserve, and the more you have of this reserve, the less likely you are to develop cognitive problems as you get older. And so, for that reason, you might think that you're more likely to pick up effects in an older group because, the young sort of can abuse their bodies and get away with it because they've got these reserves. But as you get older, they get smaller, and your history of self-abuse is sort of going to catch up with you. Some people looking worried here, but there we are. So I mean, that might be a reason. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but it would be an argument for perhaps saying that well, I can't explain why older adults haven't been studied. It's inexplicable, but they haven't.
Yeah, no, I have got some data, but I haven't analysed it. So
All right.
it's
No, I
been there
look
as
forward
well.
to that.
But there are other groups that use measures of perceived efforts when they're doing not water studies, but other nutrient studies to try to pick that apart a bit. And they sometimes find that they don't get any task differences on the task that they're measuring, but that particular group are trying a lot harder.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Is there a difficulty with this literature in the sense that blinding dehydration is almost impossible? And as you pointed out, now, if Ron, for instance, used to point out to the students in Loughborough that all the lecture theatres said no food and drink on the wall, but the student...
We took those down because the students objected to
Yeah.
the bleach of the human mind.
So if you tell a
Contrary
student...
to your lectures.
If you tell a student that they can't drink for an hour, they feel like, that's an uproar. They go to the student union and they get the signs taken down. So then if you instigate a protocol where you say, we're going to dehydrate you, does that introduce a confounding, because immediately in their head...
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, one thing is for certain. I mean, we know with any sort of human study, placebo effects, suggestion, expectation are absolutely enormous. And you're absolutely right. I can't see, if you are sitting there getting weighed every so on, or someone's asking you to give a sample of urine or whatever's happening, you obviously have a very good idea what's going on. And with it will be expectations and suggestion. I mean, I would say that what you don't know is how much you are dehydrated. So I think, I mean, as I say, there are these enormous, in our hands, over quite a small period of time, a fourfold difference in the extent to which people are losing body weight. So I think relating to that, you could reasonably conclude, well, it's double blind. I mean, even the people taking writing the numbers down aren't going to be able to do the calculations in their head and find out, that you're X% loss of body weight. So, I think that's one way around it. But it's a problem with any sort of nutritional study that, people, short of having, if you can get a pill and it can get a placebo, but even then, of course, even that's difficult. Riboflavin turns your urine yellow and things. Even that can be difficult. But I mean, with meals, it's just not possible. People know what they're eating. I mean, I can't think of a solution.
First, then you. Okay, Caroline.
Yeah. I have a question regarding if you have replicated these studies in another adults, elderly, it means mental performance, and we've
got studies ongoing at the moment. We're getting up to 100 subjects we've run. We're taking our advice seriously and running sensible sample sizes. And sort of looking at some of being rehydrated and some haven't. But we are finding effects. We don't find effects on average, but we do find effects if we relate it to the degree the individual has in terms of dehydration. But these are preliminary. They're not published, and I wouldn't draw any great conclusion because even we haven't reached that stage.
Okay. And the second question is regarding if you have completed this study also with soft drinks, sugar beverage, by the containing glucose that could add and
part of the study we have ongoing has products that are designed for rehydration. That by their nature contain both electrolytes and a little bit of glucose, which aids water uptake.
We've done 2 studies in adults, sort of getting at what other things might be going on. We did an observational study where we just went into the exam room and recorded what students are taken into the exams. And we found this nice effect where as they go through their years of study increase, then they're more likely to take drinks in. So first years, well, it's half and half. And by the time that it's their third year, most of them have got a drink. And is that a learned behaviour, that they've learnt that there's this rehydration strategy. But interestingly, when we compared in the first and second years the students that took drinks in and the students that didn't, and looked at their exam marks, the ones that took drinks in did better, even when we covaried for sort of general performance, taking their mark from another course, which is really interesting observational data, and we'd like to do an intervention as well. But it might just be that it's an emotional crutch, and that it's part of being a good student, and you have these strategies, and taking a drink into the exam room is one of those as well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to know what. Well, obviously you should, on occasions, not allow them to take them in and see if it makes a difference. But again, you wouldn't know if that was psychological, that they thought that you were just being mean and your behaviour was totally unreasonable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we did do one study where we had to get one of our groups to have a drink without sort of realising that they were having a drink. And
that's clever.
Yeah. Well, that is good. Yeah. And the researchers were very clever, because I designed the study. And I didn't have to do it. So what they did was, in one of the groups, they went out and they brought back 2 glasses of water and put them on the table. And the researcher drank the drink, and then almost every other of the participants drank the drink as well. So we were able to sort of get them to do that without telling them. We told them the study was about repeated testing, and we were looking at what happens over time. We could get them to have a drink without telling them that we wanted them to have a drink, which was interesting and quite clever.
And there were some that didn't.
There were just two, I think, that didn't have a drink.
Yeah.
But
sample of 2 is even worse than a sample of 10.
Yeah. But most of them did, which is interesting, that you can change their influence the behaviour in that way without them being aware.
Yeah, well, indeed. I mean, it's the success of marketing. I mean, selling water to, it's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, most of us have taps and don't pay anything for it, or nothing additional anyway, no marginal cost.
Do you have another?
Yeah, just in relation to your brain volume studies, my understanding of the literature is that I think only one study actually showed a change in total brain volume.
Yeah.
Well, every other study showed no change whatsoever, including a study we published. They showed small changes in ventricular volumes, but actual brain volume didn't change.
Yeah. All right.
There's animal literature that clearly shows, as you pointed out, that if you infuse hypertonic solutions, water does get drawn out of the brain, but you have to increase serum osmolality well in excess of 300 milliosmoles, which doesn't generally happen. Something that we, myself and Ron, were interested in for some time was blood-brain barrier permeability. And with hard exercise in hot environments, that there is a suggestion that maybe the permeability of the blood-brain barrier may increase, and that might change the exchange of substances in and out of the central nervous system. That might be something that could impact on CNS function and then manifest in a change in cognitive function. But I'm not entirely convinced about the brain volume. I think, for instance, the Kempton study that's cited, they show 40% changes in ventricular volume in some participants, and which to me seems enormous. And where's that going in a very confined space?
Well, I mean, it's necessarily a zero-sum game. So if the ventricles are getting larger, then something's getting smaller, and the assumption was that it's the brain. I mean, I take your point. I mean, it's a very, very crude measure. It seems to me that functional imaging is a much more sort of productive way to go, and I think will be inherently more sensitive. I published a paper last year where I probably annoyed many nutritionists by arguing that if you want to find out optimal functioning, what you need to take are psychological measures. They're inherently more sensitive than biochemistry. I mean, I'm sure that went down a treat. But I mean, the argument is that you've got the brain, which is 2% of your body weight, 20% of your basal metabolic rate. You've got, trillions of neurons, each of them with, 10,000 plus connections. You've got something of enormous complexity. So if you only got sort of 1% difference in a million neurons that ended up a million biochemical pathway actions that lead to some output, that you have potential to pick up the first effects of any sort of nutrition, or many forms of malnutrition, are psychological. People have problems of mood, sustaining attention, things of this nature. So it seems to me that if there are small effects of dehydration, you're not going to pick them up from just crude structural studies of the brain, but you might pick them up in terms of functional outcomes. But how significant and important they are is another matter. I mean, it just seems inherently improbable that evolution has developed this a brain that isn't really fit for purpose if it doesn't get a drink every half an hour. I mean, it just doesn't seem likely, does it?
Yeah. So how much of it is it a learned effect? We've got a dry mouth. Yeah. We feel like we need a drink. Does that directly influence rather than a physiological effect?
Yes, indeed. I mean, we expect to have a mid-morning break or a mid-afternoon break. We haven't had it. Yeah. Therefore, we feel as though we've been badly treated by our employer. Whatever. Humans are complex.
Thank you for that.
We use the microphone.
Of course. You commented on that change in weight in some cases correlated with some changes in cognitive function. Weighing people clinically, particularly the elderly, can sometimes be difficult. I wonder, first of all, if some of these studies reported change in cognitive function in association with other markers of dehydration, like serum or urine osmolality, or even urine output. So that's mainly my question, really. I wonder what your views on that.
Well, I mean, my view is that the studies don't exist. I think we use industrial scales that are accurate to 5 grams. We can pick up the effect of you breathing and perspiring in 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. They're that sensitive. So we've got very... and we use that because if you want changes over a period of relatively short periods of time, it seems to me to be the most sensitive measure of short-term effects. We obviously take measures of baseline osmolarity and things just to put them into a context, but we wouldn't be able to pick it up sort of half an hour or so. So multiple. So if you are going to be using this on multiple occasions, weight we find is something that's quite convenient. I don't have any experience. What's the problem with older people?
It's sometimes clinically, some older people because of multiple comorbidities may be difficult to weigh in hospital anyway because of issues with regard to their mobility. And I just sometimes that is difficult. It's not routinely done in hospitals.
Well, the scales we use are so sensitive that people just you'd have to be dead to be able to to be measured. Because the best will in the world, you move, and so what it does is it takes 50 readings over 5 seconds and averages them. Now, I'm fairly confident that there are scales available that you could use with older people. With large industrial scales, you obviously put a chair on it, and you could get people to sit on it. So I think it's not beyond.
Oh no, it's certainly doable. But in NHS, sometimes it's not practical.
That's another matter.
So I wonder what your views are on other markers. So like urine osmolality, sometimes more easily available.
I'm sure there are many people in this room that are more qualified to comment than I am. But the feel I get is that it is quite a lot. The normal range is really quite substantial. I would think that obviously you could get people who are grossly dehydrated, but if you are talking about people in the normal range is quite wide. But I'd be happy to hear other people's comments because I'm sure they're better qualified than I am.
Yeah, I have a question. So, to reach 2% loss in body weight, that must be the outcome of an intermittent fasting period. Not only dehydration, but also stop of intake of other foods.
The answer is yes. It was said in our study over 4 hours they don't eat. But in all of these studies, they've exercised. We have actually done the calculation. If you make some reasonable conclusion about the number of calories they've used, just assume it's carbohydrate, you can make some estimate of the likely sort of effect that's due to just living or actively exercising.
Yeah.
And it clearly is part of the deal.
Yeah.
But presumably it's a fairly constant.
I'm thinking of the performance curve, so physical and mental, and it is discussed also in the school age children, so the drop in the performance capacity. But I think we should also think of some biochemical biomarkers like blood glucose simply. So that if you have lost up to 2% of total body weight, it must be also in parallel.
I mean, as I say, I'll just back of the envelope calculations, just making a reasonable estimate as to what energy has been, basal metabolic rate and whatever people have been doing. The other effects are small relative to the loss of weight, presumably due to perspiration and production of urine. And also, if people are all performing identical tasks, it is a constant. So that's you're right, of course, that there will be nutrients used up to maintain life. Yes.
Maria?
I would like to put in the discussion the EFSA opinion. EFSA expressed a scientific opinion, and now there is an EU-approved claim that water balance is linked to optimal cognitive and physical performance.
I thought water wasn't. You weren't able to claim it causes dehydration. That was the last one I heard. What you? Oh, thank you. I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. Well.
Yeah, go on.
Nevertheless, we can use this as a starting point for a discussion or our position in relation to water and cognitive performance. I mean, in the text it says that loss of body water of about 1% is normally compensated within 24 hours, but without compensation and with further increase of body water loss, physical and cognitive functions are impaired. And now this is a approved claim.
I'm frankly astonished, given the sort of things that EFSA have chosen not to approve, given the evidence, and given the evidence in this area, it just suggests to me that EFSA's, it's not consistent, let's say.
Well.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just slightly stressed. I mean, EFSA is the curse of the entire food industry.
Thank you, David. A comment first on the difficulty in measuring small changes in hydration status and the use of body mass. We've talked about problems with osmolality, we've talked about problems with urine markers and so on, but body mass is not free of problems either. As we all sit here, we're producing about 1 ml a minute of urine, which is going into the bladder. Effectively, any water in my bladder is not part of my body water. So that won't appear as a change in body mass, but will appear as a change in body water. Also, as we oxidize substrates, we generate water. For every gram of carbohydrate, we generate about 0.6 grams of water, and for every gram of fat, about 1.1 grams of water. Yes. So the body mass change is not, when we're looking at small changes over short periods of time, terribly reliable as an index of change in hydration. I think we need to be a little bit cautious. Yeah,
I mean, certainly the work that we're doing. I mean, people start off with an empty bladder and end up with an empty bladder. And what is clear is that although they've been under identical conditions, the amount of urine produced is actually is one of the strongest predictor of the cognitive effects. So there's, hence my questions about individual differences in physiology, because quite clearly people in the same situation are reacting in very different ways, and the actual production of urine is actually very helpful. If you're that sort of person.
It's a very good measure of hydration status.
Yes.
how fast you're producing that urine.
Yes.
The other comment I was going to make, you very clearly highlighted some of the problems with the studies in the literature. They've used exercise in the heat, and you change body temperature, you induce fatigue, and all the other things that go with exercise. And you highlighted the problems with many of the cognitive function tests with floor effects and ceiling effects. Susan's not going to raise it, but I'll raise it on her behalf. She did what I thought was a nice study where she had subjects who were followed once for 2 days when they ate and drank normally, and once for the same period when they ate the same food but fluid intake was restricted. Instead of measuring performance, she gave them some visual analog scales to look at things like mood, ability to concentrate, and of course those are effectively open-ended scales from comatose to fully alert. And already within, I think, 12 hours, Susan, when body loss was about 1%, she could see changes in alert. I've got the slide in front of me. Alertness, ability to concentrate, headache, and tiredness. So some of those effects begin to be apparent.
Yes.
Whether they translate into performance outcomes, but if you feel less alert, it's probably not a good thing.
Well, no, I mean, the thing is that I mean, measures of mood and measures of cognition are obviously separate, but if, whether you are prepared to engage, how long you are prepared to carry on with what is almost inevitably a very tedious and boring task, because most psychological tasks are, will depend on mood. So mood is absolutely basic. I mean, it's a fairly easy thing to measure and doesn't seem terribly robust, but it is actually a very, very sensitive and predictive index.
Yeah, David, the using functional imaging is clearly an attractive use of a new technique, but if you're just doing bold responses, then it's an increase in flow over and above the baseline flow, and it's a tiny increase as well. 1% usually is the bold response.
Yes.
If you've got dehydration, then you'd expect the baseline flow to be down. And so actually you might get an enhanced fMRI response because it's the same absolute increase, but it's over a smaller baseline. So whenever possible, you need to measure total gray matter blood flow as well as the bold response to a functional stimulus in order to know exactly what's going on. Because a lot of the tricks that are played with fMRI is you drop the baseline flow to start with by giving people caffeine, and then you get a much bigger response. And that's one of the tricks of the trade that's been used for a long time, just to enhance responses. So use ASL or something else to measure the baseline flow, especially in the elderly, where it is, I'm afraid, going down extremely rapidly with age.
Yes.
We measured some type 2 diabetics' total gray matter blood flow and were stunned when it was about 45 mils per 100 mils per minute in a 50-year-old type 2 diabetic. So we got some non-diabetics, and it was about 55 mils in them, whereas a healthy young person, it would be up around 80 or 90. But then you can, if you've got the flow and you can see whether the absolute flow has changed, then the functional response makes a lot more sense. Whereas without a flow to build it on, it's a bit difficult to know what's going on.
Well, that's a good point. Thank you.
Now it's Caroline.
Thank you. I had a question about measurement, which is probably more of a group question. I wanted to raise it after Larry's talk, but I thought I'd wait. So lots of the studies that have found effects on cognition have used urine osmolality as a measurement of hydration status. And there was a study within the last year or so that reported that 60% or 66% of children attending school in England, in France, in Italy and the USA were dehydrated by the urine osmolality measurement when they arrived at school in the morning, which, if it's true, is quite shocking. And it's an interesting question about whether that relates to function at school, because they didn't take any measures of behaviour or cognition or so on and so on. But after seeing, so I'm struggling a bit with osmolality, because after seeing Larry's talk, when it seems that there's a range. So you said that after 800 they'd be at risk of dehydration rather than saying that they are dehydrated. So is that cut-off a sensible cut-off, the 800 osmoles, or should we be thinking about it on a more individual basis like you're suggesting? And then what do we do practically when we're using these measurements and relating them to cognitive performance? Help!
I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask, but I'm sure the right person is in this room. all looking at their shoes.
No, really?
I think when you do spot measurements of urine osmolality, it's not uncommon, especially based on time of day, early morning, to see those types of indicators of dehydration in children, but they fluctuate through the day. One of the issues in the U.S. right now is taking vending machines out of schools, especially middle schools and high schools, because of the content of the beverages that people put in there. But they're taking them out with bottled water, and they're taking them out with sports drinks and so on. And if you track kids of all ages through the day, you can see progressive dehydration, which is problematic, not only because of learning, but because some of those later in the day, some of those children then go out to the athletic fields and participate as well. They catch up at night, but I think it's a transient, yeah. So even morning versus afternoon at school, there are differences.
And a follow-up to that is
Can I
if
just make a comment
yeah.
on that? I'd echo those points about single measurements, and it really is a problem, and just how big a problem came to my attention a few years ago, speaking to the guys who run the anti-doping laboratories, where athletes give urine samples after they've taken part in sport. And one of the guys spontaneously mentioned that they often saw very low specific gravities, which is a proxy for osmolality, in the marathon runners after hot weather competition. And what happens is these guys sweat a lot, they're severely dehydrated, they know it's going to be difficult to produce a urine sample, they don't want to be sat there for 3 or 4 hours, so as soon as they're called for doping control, they drink about 2 liters of water, they get a prompt diuresis, they produce a very dilute urine, in spite of the fact they're still dehydrated. So that urine sample does not reflect body hydration status. It's an acute diuresis caused by ingesting a very large volume of fluid. And in these other situations where we take a spot sample, it can be very misleading depending on what's being consumed previously.
Okay, well, that makes it worse. Okay, but if we wanted to do an intervention study, so if we wanted to do a study where we measure children at the beginning of the school day, and then they are dehydrated and we rehydrate them, how sensitive and how time sensitive are the measures? How much water would we need to give them, and how much longer would we need to test them? Is there any guidance on that?
Well, can you comment on it? No. May I ask a question then? Can we see any different reactions to dehydration depending on the acuteness? The acute dehydration that is usually induced and the one that is more prolonged and takes over time.
That's the conversation we had.
What they are, if they are in.
Well, the answer...
Susan did something on this. Maybe in children you
no,
also
I mean Susan's study seems to be one possible example, but there are not many. The simple fact is that most of them tend to be in acute, some sort of event, some sort of exercise, heat, and then sort of, either rehydration or not, as the case may be. But the fact that people may have a pattern that over a period of weeks and months they are continually sort of have a low level of hydration is not a topic that I'm aware that's been studied to any great extent in terms of cognition. I know people have done it in terms of disease sort of susceptibility and kidney functioning.
Maybe this is something that can explain some variability in the
observations yes, indeed,
because they can be dehydrated chronically. And
yes,
what you see is that acute changes imposed over this people so acutely. So it's one thing, and the other is how you can differentiate between the impact of dehydration and the unpleasant feelings that disturb children, and they start before you can see the dehydration, because they start earlier. The dry mouth, the sticky saliva, and they are disturbed with this. How you can differentiate dehydration from the symptoms of dehydration?
No answer to that. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think it just comes back to the complexities of human beings, and these things are all connected to each other, and teasing one from the other. I don't know how you could do that. You'd need
I
you'd
do,
you'd
so
need
that's
a
why I'm
dry you'd need a dry mouth and to be well hydrated and
There's
and
a physical performance study where they looked at mouth rinsing and spitting out. It didn't completely restore performance. I think it restored a part. If I can follow up,
Yeah,
the
definitely.
the longer term fluid restriction model is a nice one, but there is always a caveat to that, in the sense that if you're restricting fluid, what you're often restricting is caffeine also. And if I don't have caffeine for 24 hours, I'm not a good person to be around. And I'm certainly not going to want to put my best performance, well, I'm not going to put my best performance across. So caffeine withdrawal always becomes an issue in fluid restriction type studies. But in my case anyway, and perhaps many others.
Most people.
Study group.
The other thing that has been raised quite recently is there was a perceived wisdom that you couldn't adapt to dehydration, you couldn't become more tolerant to it. There's a recent study looking at physical performance where they measured performance and then put the participants through a series of dehydration exposures and then measured performance again. There was still a decrement in performance, but the decrement was less because the individuals had been repeatedly exposed to the sensation of being dehydrated going through that exercise.
Were they still comparably dehydrated? It wasn't that they physiologically adapted in some manner, I mean.
Yeah, they were physiologically exactly the same,
Yes.
but their subjective feelings in terms of rating perceived exertion was restored somewhat, and their physical performance was still less than it was when they were hydrated, but there was some attenuation of that decrement.
I mean,
so, and we see with athletes who regularly go through dehydration processes, so weight category athletes who drop 5, 6, 7% of their body mass over a very short period of time, they're able to tolerate that to some extent. So I guess my question is, does repeated exposure allow you just to become accustomed to those feelings of dry mouthedness, etc., that then may offset some of the decrement?
I don't know. I don't have.
That's probably a study that needs.
It's a study needs doing. But I mean, my response to what you say is that I'm slightly surprised that if you subject people repeatedly to anything, that the body does not adapt. I mean, the body isn't just doesn't sit there and say, "Oh, hit me again." If you drink alcohol dehydrogenase is upregulated.
Well, if
you take caffeine,
Well, if you space the sessions sufficiently apart, so you're not inducing heat acclimation, for instance. So if you have one session a week over a period of weeks, rather than having several sessions close together, which would then induce a heat acclimation and a physiological adaptation.
Yes.
You sufficiently space the sessions. So there's sort of a
memory of the experience,
rather than a physiological.
Yes, all right.
Yeah.
Yes, all right.
Yeah, repeated sessions close together would induce heat acclimation, or if you're using that model, which would then reduce physiological change.
I wanted to, excuse me, dry mouth, dehydration.
Yes.
I wanted to return to the issue of dehydration in children and versus thirst and signs and symptoms. The key visual signs of dehydration are dry mouth, chapped lips, loss of skin turgor, lethargy, fatigue, and changes in mood. At the other end of the age spectrum, all of those describe the typical 85-year-old. So it's very difficult to diagnose dehydration in people in the older end of the age spectrum because, number one, sensitivity is decreased. Yeah. Number two, they already look like they're dehydrated all of the time. So one of the few things that is a reliable indicator of dehydration in that age population are furrows in the tongue. Yeah. And so more and more clinicians are being trained to look for tongue furrowing when all these other symptoms are always present in many people in the aged population.
Right. At what point does
late signs,
yes.
Unfortunately.
Yes, exactly.
There are no symptoms at the beginning. The signs begin before the symptoms. but there's already moderate to severe dehydration when you lose more than 2% up to 5% of body weight. So it's a very late sign.
Yes.
And some people do not report at all that they have dry mouth, or they are so used to it that it's normal feeling for them. So, this is the problem with the elderly.
I was just going to make a comment on the athletes. I think when you say those guys who make weight in sport regularly cope well with 5, 6, even 10% dehydration, I think if you can't do that, you don't do those sports. And we see a lot of people who drop out simply because they can't cope with it. And when I speak to some of those guys, they do say they still feel bad, but they stop complaining about it because nobody listens. And I think there's an element of that. You recognize the symptoms, it doesn't feel good, but you tolerate the symptoms without complaining.
I think I don't necessarily mean they tolerate well with the 5, 6, the very extreme, but they tolerate with the more moderate. When we've done the dehydration, rehydration protocols that yourself and Susan undertook for many years, you get people who are unaccustomed to that type of protocol, and at 2% dehydration they're hanging and in pieces, whereas those guys will do that and then without even it touching the surface and go way beyond.
But you have to remember too, the people who volunteer for those experiments are a very select group, because restricting many people, we say we want you to come in without breakfast, and that scores off 50% of the potential population of volunteers. The concept of going into work without breakfast is totally alien to some people. The concept of doing without food for 12 hours is totally alien to many people today. So we're dealing with a very unusual group of individuals when we ask them to take part in these experiments. And I don't think we acknowledge that as often as we perhaps should. There are self-selected groups who are willing to undertake these procedures.
What's the time scale? I mean, you've got an athlete who's lost a considerable amount of body fluid. How long does it take them to rehydrate? I mean, properly advised.
Some of them remarkably quickly. I remember a case of a wrestler who was a very lean guy. He was weighing about 72 kilos. A week later, he was fighting at 62 kilos. So he's already lean. He's going to lose 10 kilos in the last week. He then has 24 hours for weigh-in and competition, and he'll fight at 72 kilos. So he's going to gain those 10 kilos back in 24 hours.
Astonishing.
Where some of the textbook guidelines are misleading, because a lot of the textbooks say at 10% dehydration it's death.
Yeah, well, that's not 10% dehydration.
Well,
it's more than 10%.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'm saying. That's why I'm saying the guidelines are misleading.
Yes, but again, we're talking about the difference between individuals and averages, and most people couldn't possibly tolerate that level of dehydration and still function, and these guys can. So they're remarkably resistant to the effects of dehydration.
Is that genetic, or is that built tolerance over time?
I think it's a mixture, but not everybody could do that. Yeah. Most of us who try to do that couldn't do it. Yeah. So if you can't do it, you drop out of those weight category sports. Yeah. But again, an example, we talk about using markers of hydration, speaking to some of the boxers in Tallahassee and pre-Olympic training camps. We gave them urine color charts and encouraged them to look at the color of their urine to assess hydration. I asked one of the boxers, had he looked at his urine color? He said no. I said, why not? He hadn't been to the toilet today. Well, when did you last ever pee? He said, on the aeroplane on the way out. That was 2 days previously. And that was considered normal for boxers.
According to the rules. Okay, obviously this is an important point, but I think it's very much depends on the duration and this rate of dehydration. When it takes longer, you can go even lower. We can see in clinical settings people that lose up to 10% of their body weight, and they recover nicely even from acute renal injury with hydration only. And this happens, but it takes days to get it. Obviously, this depends also on the sodium and the clinical setting and the comorbidities they have. But usually, yes, we can see this, and this is not lethal, absolutely, but they cannot cope with this very well, and they are not functioning well with this, not at all. They are usually comatose. Any other questions?
There's one there.
Yep.
You mentioned Muslims during Ramadan and degree of dehydration that they might experience throughout a day. Have any studies been done amongst that group? And do
Well, the
those
person
reveal-
on your left and your far right,
Yeah.
there was I don't know if you've got any more details to
Not on the cognitive functioning.
No.
Well, I can say something on that. Yes, I mean, the mood slightly changes during Ramadan.
Yes.
Individuals who are exercising quite hard. And we looked at a group of elite, near elite youth football players. During Ramadan, mood decreased. A lot of the cognitive measures, the gross ones, changed, but exercise performance, no difference whatsoever. And we didn't actually measure real cognitive function as such, but feelings of cognitive ability were slightly depressed, but not hugely depressed.
But of course, you've got changes in blood glucose as well as changes in hydration status, because there's an absence of food as well as fluid.
Sure.
And if you look at the epidemiology from the Middle East, the road traffic accidents go up during Ramadan, all sorts of other things happen. If you need an operation in the Middle East during Ramadan, you don't want to get a surgeon who's fasting.
You've also got to remember caffeine withdrawal and lack of smoking. Yes.
Actually,
Although,
sorry, just something that occurs from Phil's comment. You saying that long time you become a little bit crotchety if you have caffeine withdrawal. But of course, any study that has just an overnight fast, you come without breakfast, you are suffering from caffeine withdrawal, because we're all, most of us are addicted to caffeine, and most of the benefits of caffeine are actually a reversal of withdrawal effects. I mean, it's undoubtedly a psychoactive drug, but much of the effect is reversal. So it's not only a problem for long-term study. Sorry, Caroline.
No, I was just saying, I just collected some pilot data on fasting in children. They're 11 and 12-year-olds using cognitive tests, and we did find that they got their attention was worse when they were tested whilst fasting.
They felt their attention.
No, we measured their attention. Yeah, no, we tested it, and it was worse when they were fasting. Yeah.
There's a confounding factor with the Ramadan style fasting in the sense that it's a holy month, and they feel that
They feel there's great benefits
Yeah.
in it,
Yes.
both
So-
psychologically
yeah.
and physically.
Yeah.
And yes. So, I mean, motivation comes into this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, if you...
And in many populations, you get weight gain over Ramadan.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It's a redistribution.
The amount of food that's consumed in the dark hours is enormous. You
Yes.
get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to have breakfast, and you break fast with a big party at 8 or 9 at night. And many countries observe the Mecca time zones.
Yes.
Even in this country, they do.
Yes.
It's Ramadan in July and August, even in the south, they will follow the Mecca time
Yes.
than anywhere else.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you would like to express an opinion about the best methodology for studying cognition, best practice maybe, psychometric tests, brain markers, imaging,
Well, I think it's...
combination, of course.
I don't think there is a simple answer. I mean, you've got to look at each population separately, ask what particular aspect of cognition you're interested in, marry the two together. My personal, we are talking about small effects. I mean, at the most, if they exist. I suspect they do exist. I wrote a review paper where I suggested it was highly improbable, but ever since I've actually started studying it, the evidence I keep getting seems to suggest I was wrong. So there was. No, there aren't. I mean, it depends entirely on what you want. You give me a situation, a particular group of people, what your hypothesis is. So I can't just give you. There are not off-the-shelf answers each one is tailored to the situation, and it may well need to be piloted to make sure that the measures are sensitive enough and there is the possibility of improvement and decrement in performance with that test for that group of people. I'm afraid there aren't easy solutions.
That becomes particularly apparent if you're interested in specific athletic groups as well, because certain athletic groups will excel in certain tests. So what a basketball player excels in may be very different to what a soccer or a football player might excel in on a computer-based test. Do you need sport-specific testing to then be able to detect whether an intervention has had an effect or not? So, as David pointed out, it's really not a simple just use these battery tests.
We also did a simulated game and looked at skill performance, as well as you would expect when they're dehydrated, their speed up and down the floor eventually degrades, but they also made fewer free throws, fewer three-point attempts. So there was skill-related deficits starting again at 2%.
Just a brief question. Obviously, to demonstrate changes in cognitive function before and after you dehydrate the subjects, they perform the same cognitive test. What do you feel, or how much does the learning effect of this repeated measure affect the results? It may be partly an explanation for why people haven't been able to report significant differences.
Yeah. I mean, there's more than learning. You know, people develop strategies. Initially, they're novel, they're interesting. They then become boring, tedious. It's something that doesn't happen as often as it should do in this area. Often people, you would have a placebo and an active treatment. You then have half the group that does placebo active and the other one active placebo. And people say this controls for order. It doesn't. What it allows you to do is to study if there is an effect of order. And what you need to do is to put order of presentation into your statistics. And when you do that, very, very frequently you get an interaction between order of presentation and treatment. So, you go to the textbooks and they say repeated measures designs within subject designs that's really what you should be doing. In my view, it decreases in theory the number of subjects you need. But if you then get this interaction with order of presentation, the data are often uninterpretable. And quite often people don't even bother to look. So yeah, there is a problem. What you need to do is to have some sort of design that allows you to establish if learning effects are there. But I mean, the first day you do something, it's novel. You've got to work out what you're doing. Often people develop strategies. So it's not so much that their memory is better, but they've actually sussed out the test and can find a way that improves their performance. And the next time, they're obviously different people. They're not doing that. They can go straight to functioning. So it's actually, psychological functioning is not, it's not a sort of biochemical assay that under these conditions you get the same number, within measurement error each time. No two group of people the same. No group of people the same twice. It's not. It is a really difficult situation, and there's just so much going on.
And the last question from Ibrahim, please.
Very simple question. So, shouldn't we consider the duration of the restriction of fluid intake?
Yes.
So, because again, to the Ramadan fasting, during the daytime they don't drink.
Yes.
But if you take the body weight change or the body mass change after 24 hours, they have after rehydration, so after sunset, so they have got enough fluids back. And I think it is a little bit misleading if we say at a certain point of time we check the body weight and say it is 2% or 3% loss.
Yeah. But when you're testing them, you can say that 2%.
Of course, but I should mention that this is the test after 3 hours of dehydration or water restriction.
Yes, but at least in Ramadan, we normally stipulate when the last time they ate and drank.
Yeah.
And then
Before sunrise. Before sunrise.
so normally we put in the time
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
they'd finish eating and drinking.
Mhm.
I think I've heard already comments that we are getting dehydrated and our attention goes down, as I can understand.
And low blood glucose
Diminishes.
and
Thank you
irritability.
very much for the discussion and the paper. And the small summary is that it's extremely challenging to try to evaluate the psychological functions, especially because it's so difficult to measure the status of dehydration.
Yes.
And surely we can see changes with 1 or 2% of body weight reduction, maybe half. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I told you dehydration, lack of attention. It was proof of the presentation. Yes. Okay. So thank you very much, everybody.
All right.